Volunteer UCF. I'm the Civic Engagement Director, and I just wanted to say thank you guys for attending today. Hopefully everybody will get something out of this. And yeah, so I'm going to pass it off to Mr. Paul Leader. He's the Director of UCF Debate, and he's going to be facilitating this today.
Thank you, Annabelle. And first, of course, thanks to Volunteer UCF, who is our partner for this event. We appreciate the invitation, and we appreciate the opportunity to renew the idea of public debate here on the UCF campus. Of course, public debate has a long and proud history in our democracy, and we hope that we can do this again sometime. I also want to thank all of the audience members for attending. We're going to have a debate presentation that takes about an hour. I'll sort of explain that in a minute. Hopefully you'll get some interesting information out of it. And of course, I never miss an opportunity to sort of give a free plug for UCF Debate because I'm the director of the program. It's interesting if you look at empirical research, the benefits that you can get from participating in this activity. There's actually studies that demonstrate that debaters, like the people you see up here on this stage, have better critical thinking skills. They get better grade point averages. They are more likely to be accepted into graduate school or law school, and they're more likely to actually pass once they get in. And if you like money, people who participate in competitive debate actually make higher salaries over the course of their career than people that don't. And there's a lot of other similar statistics like that. So needless to say, if after hearing the presentation you decide you might be interested, I would be the guy to talk to, and we'd love to have you join us. I want to introduce the participants. Basically, we'll have an affirmative team of 2 individuals that will support the proposition, and the specific wording we'll be using today is resolved that the United States should legalize marijuana. Basically, the affirmative team will be 2 individuals. Matthew Johnson will be the very first speaker. He joined the UCF debate team last spring. Due to some last-minute lineup changes, I'm going to be the second affirmative speaker. As much as I regret that coming out of retirement after all these many years. And then we have the team on the negative that has a difficult job. The first negative speaker is going to be Taylor Johnson. She is a senior member of the team, and she's basically been a part of UCF debate for her entire career here. For the second negative speaker, also coming out of retirement, is my assistant coach, Jonathan Zukowski, who agreed to participate today once I explained to him that I would withhold his paycheck if he did not participate. So we're delighted to have him. Today's format will go something like this. We'll start with 4 speeches that are called constructive speeches of about 7 minutes. The affirmative team is considered always to have both the burden of proof and the burden of persuasion in a debate. So we will start the presentation with Matthew's speech, then there will be a 2-minute question and answer period called cross-examination. Then the negative team will have a speech. And after all 4 speakers are done with their main presentation, then we have a series of 4 short rebuttal speeches. And we actually reverse the order there since we have the burden of proof, even though we don't think that's too tough. The negative actually starts the rebuttals, and then we get the very final speech where I will have the pleasure of standing up and explaining to you one last time why everything they said was wrong. Having said all that, let's go ahead and get started. And we begin with the first affirmative speaker in today's debate, Mr. Jones.
Sorry everyone, I'm a little hungover today. However, if marijuana were legalized, that wouldn't really be a problem. Alright. The late great conservative commenter William F. Buckley Jr. once said, "Even if one takes every reefer madness allegation of the prohibitionists at face value, marijuana prohibition has done far more harm to far more people than marijuana ever could." Because prohibitionist policies empirically have always failed, and our present prohibition on marijuana produces far more harm than good, my partner and I are firmly resolved: the United States should legalize marijuana. We will prove that legalization is justified by examining 3 major benefits that a change in policy will produce: economics, justice, and human lives. We begin our analysis with contention number 1. Legalization will provide a major boost to our struggling economy. Legalization and regulation massively benefits state budgets and saves money from arrest, says Getman from 2007. The market in marijuana in the United States is illicit, illegal, and as such it diverts capital away from the channels of the licit and legal economy, especially the channels from which local, state, and federal government collect tax revenue, In this respect, the emergence and growth of the illegal marijuana market is an act of creative destruction on the ability of the government to collect tax revenue. This minimal model produces a total loss of tax revenue close to $15.9 billion. A more accurate estimation of lost tax revenue can be acquired through the examination of current levels of government revenue as a percentage of the gross domestic product, or GDP. This diversion of funds into the illicit market in marijuana costs government $31.1 billion in tax revenue annually. Local, state, and the federal government receive 28.7% of the GDP in tax revenue. If the money spent on marijuana were instead spent on legal goods, it would add $112.9 billion to the GDP, producing $11.6 billion in revenue to the state and local governments, $7.2 billion to the federal government in Social Security and other social insurance premiums, and $12.2 billion in other federal tax revenue. Marijuana prohibition results in the creative destruction of $31.1 billion in tax revenue. In addition, by improving government budgets, legalization will reduce unemployment and important social benefits like our educational and healthcare systems, says Sandler and Adversa from 2011. Deep spending cuts by state and local governments pose a growing threat to an economy that is already grappling with high unemployment, depressed home prices, and surging costs of oil. Lawmakers at state capitals and city halls are already slashing jobs and programs, arguing that some pain now is better than a lot more pain later. But the cuts are coming at a price. Weaker growth at national levels. State and local governments account for 91% of all government spending on primary education, according to the Brookings Institution. And they provide 71% of higher education spending. States are also account for more than 70% of spending on roads, bridges, and other infrastructures. But those same governments cut spending at 2.4% rate at the end of last year. And economists predict that they will slash their budget by 2.5% more this year, potentially the sharpest reduction since 1943. The ending of federal stimulus programs is also widening state deficits. Many governors, including those in Florida, New York, and Colorado, are pursuing tighter budgets. The proposals include laying off public workers and teachers, reducing spending for education and healthcare, and ending some social services. Overall, legalization of marijuana will improve our economic situation by billions of dollars because it ends wasteful spending and also brings in new revenue. As the above evidence establishes, this produces concrete benefits such as more income and better jobs for working families that are struggling, better education and healthcare, and numerous other spin-off benefits. In addition, we will now provide a second concrete benefit, in that legalization promotes justice and restores integrity to our system. First, we note that criminal punishment for a victimless crime is simply immoral. Brian A. Ford said in 2013 that the moral argument for legalization is that it is simply wrong to punish an individual for using a substance. Because there is no direct harm to any person other than the user, drug use is a prime example of a victimless crime. The price paid by those prosecuted for drug offenses far exceeds mere imprisonment or fines assigned by criminal sanction. The prospects that an individual will ever rehabilitate into society are dashed by the stigma that is borne by criminal prosecution or conviction. Employers have the right to examine an applicant's criminal background, as do landlords and schools. Further, federal aid to that person is cut off. Since the prohibition model was launched in 1970, there have been more than 20 million Americans arrested just for marijuana possession, and therefore who are ineligible for student loans, housing assistance programs, and many other benefits enjoyed by most citizens. Even if drug use is seen as a punishable offense, the price paid by those prosecuted is widely disproportionate to the harms of the crime. Second, prohibition and the war on drugs have produced side effects or consequences that should never be tolerated. Specifically, in our zeal to prosecute, we have effectively shredded the Bill of Rights, perhaps the most important protections of the individual liberty ever devised. The Honorable Juan R. Torello of the U.S. Supreme Court of Appeals said in 2011, as happens with all wars, the first casualties of this war have been objectivity, truth, and ultimately the law itself. Such has been the case with this conflict. The rule of law as relates to the civil and constitutional rights has been mangled at the hands of the executive branch that has pushed enforcement to limits of what amounts to a theory that the ends justify the means. A judiciary which has generally been compliant and stretched even those limits to the breaking point, failing to contain the other branches within the fence that is established by the Constitution. The embattled Fourth Amendment is probably the leading example of a war on drugs casualty. In addition, we know that the enforcement of this prohibition reveals that a very clear, disturbing fact. The enforcement of marijuana laws demonstrates a very clear racial bias. In short, drug enforcement in this country is racist, and that is a moral evil that should never be tolerated. Stephen W. Bender said in 2013, Given the racialized origins of our initial regulation of the core of illicit drugs, it is not surprising that the U.S. drug enforcement came to target communities of color. Eventually, that enforcement would help define us in recent decades as a nation of mass incarnation that imprisons at the world's highest rate. Along with cocaine, marijuana plays an important role in our culture of incarceration that profiles Black and Mexican users and dealers for punishment under the rallying cry of the war on drugs. Police at all levels of government concentrated anti-drug initiatives in neighborhoods of color along the U.S.-Mexico border, resulting in today's staggeringly low racialized prison population that Professor Michael Alexander labeled the new Jim Crow. Of the more than 21 million drug arrests since the inception of the war on drugs, most were for mere possession rather than dealing drugs, and most involved marijuana. Constituting almost 80% of the growth in the 1990s drug arrests, marijuana alone accounts for 750,000 annual U.S. arrests, and most for possession. In 2007, the example state and local police arrested 872,721 people for marijuana offenses. Despite studies confirming that white youth use marijuana to the same extent as Black or Latino youth, the police long stand accused of targeting youth of color for traffic stops, known as driving while Black or driving while Hispanic, stopping for searches and other encounters in their neighborhoods that lead to disproportionate arrests. As reported by Human Rights Watch in 2000, African Americans constituted 80 to 90% of drug offenders in prison in 7 states, and at least 15 states imprison Blacks on drug charges at rates of 20 to 57 times greater than white men. So we have now demonstrated that legalization will produce economic benefits and put the justice back in our justice system. However, we conclude with a third and equally important benefit of legalization. Legalization saves human lives. First, we note that prohibition actually creates violence. The Honorable Juan R. Torello of the Supreme Court of Appeals again said in 2011, perhaps the most important benefit in terms of the mayhem that our present strategy is causing is that legalization will eliminate the criminal element from the production and distribution of marijuana and its attendant underground acquisition of wealth and its accompanying violence. As far back as 1991, Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, an advocate of drug legalization, estimated that in the United States alone, as many as 10,000 homicides per year, unrelated to overdosing issues, were plausibly attributed to the drug market wars between the cartels. This, of course, does not even begin to account for the bloodbaths in Colombia and Mexico, for which, at a minimum, we are morally responsible for causing with our massive consumption of illegal drugs. Finally, we note that legalization will, of course, end most of this violence. In conclusion, our evidence clearly demonstrates that prohibition is a doomed policy and that legalization will produce significant concrete benefits for our society. Thank you.
All right, so the first thing I want to ask you about is the economics argument that you talked about. It gives examples of things like unemployment or wasteful spending will be cut in order to increase the amount of revenue. Does your evidence take into account anywhere revenue that will be lost as a result?
Yes.
Where exactly does it do that?
In our first topic, it says that the annual supply of marijuana spent is considered the impact, and that it takes into account the illicit and illegal trade difference.
Okay. On the justice argument you make, your evidence gives examples of things like stop and frisk and cocaine laws causing equal problems for non-whites. How exactly would legalizing marijuana solve back to this racism then?
We don't have to solve for all forms of racism. We just have to solve for tools of racism that legalizing marijuana.
Okay, so then this will not actually end the sort of violent policing that we see. Why wouldn't the police just shift then to other racist forms of, policing people then?
They may, but they won't have that specific tool to do it.
So what's the advantage then if it's just going to shift to something else?
We get rid of that tool. I mean, I'm guessing that it's a good thing to get rid of specific ways we would do that.
Okay. You said as well that marijuana use is a victimless crime. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Marijuana doesn't affect anyone aside from the actual user of the drug.
Okay, because you say in your next contention about human lives that the cartels are causing bloodbaths. It doesn't sound like it's a victimless crime then if there are bloodbaths happening as a result of marijuana use. In fact, it sounds like there's a lot of victims of it.
Basically, our argument is the bloodbaths are because of the prohibition. It's not the substance itself, it's the prohibition.
Okay. And the last thing I want to ask as well, your evidence talks about the war on drugs, and it always talks about the war on drugs in that evidence, not marijuana specifically. So how big of a role does marijuana actually play in this, war on drugs that's causing all this violence from the cartels?
Can everyone hear me? Cool. Okay. In the early 20th century, there were wild stories of marijuana destroying lives and wrecking the nation. Looking back, one can't help but wonder how people believed such obvious fear-mongering. Today, the script has been flipped and updated. Now there are wild stories of marijuana laws destroying lives and wrecking the nation. And once again, you have to wonder how people believe it. The truth is, Jonathan and I don't think that all of the laws against marijuana are good. We don't think marijuana is a gateway drug, a source of funding for terrorism, a cause of social collapse, or any of the other lies told. But we do think that the affirmative's plan to immediately legalize marijuana is not a good idea, and that we can be, as Edmund Burke was described, liberal and counter-revolutionary. Our first contention is statistical manipulation. The statistics cited in favor of legalization are often misrepresentations, and the affirmative is guilty of this skew. The Office of National Drug Control Policy has documented two specific methods by which this occurs. First, if a person is sent to prison for a number of crimes and marijuana-related charges are one of them, that person is technically in prison for the marijuana-related crime. Take the following example, direct from the Office of National Drug Control Policy. A man is arrested for rape and assault, and at the time of his arrest, police discover a bag of marijuana in his pocket. After being found guilty at a trial of all charges, the man is sentenced to 20 years in prison for rape and assault, and 1 year concurrent for marijuana possession. Obviously, marijuana didn't put him in prison, nor did it affect his sentence in any way. But technically, he is in prison for marijuana possession, and will show up in the statistics as such. The second trick used to skew statistics is related to plea bargains. When you hear about people in prison for possession, they aren't always old hippies or innocent kids railroaded by a heartless justice system. They're criminals who have avoided more serious charges by pleading down to a lesser possession charge. Our second contention is, to put it simply, what's the rush? As our argument about statistics show, the harms for marijuana criminalization simply aren't true. Upending decades of drug policy is going to have many far-reaching unintended consequences. Such a change all at once on a national level is grossly irresponsible and dangerous. This is especially true with marijuana now legal in 2 states. If legalization's benefits really do outweigh the harms, then we should see these results in Colorado and Washington. Waiting a few years and seeing whether this is true or not is a far more intelligent strategy than rushing headfirst into an untested policy. Now I'd like to shift gears and talk about the affirmative's advantages. First is their economic advantage. This entire advantage rests on a faulty assumption that legalization will result in everyone purchasing marijuana through legal means. A taxed and regulated product sold in stores is far more expensive than one sold by a dealer. According to Colorado State University, it will actually be 318% more expensive. This inevitable rise in cost is why black markets still exist for things like tobacco and alcohol in the United States, which are legal right now. Their argument also fails to take into account the cost of public health. DUIDs and the costs associated with them will rise. According to the Christian Science Monitor, in the first 6 months of 2013, police found 745 drivers with THC levels over the legal limit. That was just after 6 months. In both of the years before that, there were only about 1,000 people per year found with equally high levels of marijuana in their system. And people's health will suffer even if just from inhaling smoke. And the large amount of dangerous particulate matter that goes with smoke ensures that our national health costs will rise as well. Additionally, the loss of productivity resulting from marijuana legalization would offset any benefits from taxation and result in economic decline. According to the National Drug Intelligence Center, the economy would suffer a loss of $193 billion per year due to illness, loss of productivity, accidents, and crimes resulting from marijuana legalization. Finally, their evidence relies on the idea that legalizing marijuana will reduce the amount of money spent on correctional costs. But absent a retroactive overturn of marijuana convictions, which would be a bureaucratic nightmare, the total number of people currently imprisoned on marijuana-related charges would not be reduced, meaning that in the short term at least, there would be no change in the spending on correctional facilities. Not to mention, as I discussed in our statistical manipulation contention, the majority of people who are supposedly imprisoned as a result of marijuana-related charges aren't actually serving any extra time for those charges, but are serving concurrent time along with sentences for worse crimes like domestic abuse or rape.
Their next contention is about justice. First and foremost, this argument is a prime example of statistical manipulation, as I explained earlier. The people in prison for marijuana-related crimes are not harmless, innocent people, but criminals who are often in for another more serious crime, not one related to marijuana. Also, the affirmative has not advocated any laws that will prevent housing providers or employers from drug testing applicants. This means all of the problems that they claim arise from marijuana prohibition, such as discrimination against people who have been convicted of marijuana-related crimes, would not be overcome simply by legalizing marijuana because other companies would still drug test applicants. And while their goal of standing against racism is laudable, we have to be realistic about the effect it will have. Racist police officers won't be solved by legalizing marijuana. They will just shift their attention to other forms of discrimination. Additionally, as I already stated, legalizing marijuana won't do anything to help the people who are already in prison as a result of marijuana-related charges. Finally, is their argument about violence. First off, recall the argument above about black markets still existing even when drugs are legalized. They may shrink the market for cartels, but they will certainly not eliminate it. This will actually worsen violence, as cartels will have to fight even more fiercely for their shrinking market share. This argument isn't just speculation either. According to Stephen Bender, their author, who is a professor of law at the Seattle University of Law, cartels are already switching to other criminal activities to support falling drug profits. Specifically, they're moving on to human trafficking, especially underage prostitutes. At the end of the day, I think we can all agree we would much rather see marijuana illegally smuggled into the United States than defenseless women and girls forced into careers as sex slaves. To summarize my points, everything in the affirmatives case is either statistical invention of legalization advocates or a problem that they simply can't fix. With 2 states now experimenting with legalization, the other 48 should wait and see what happens before making any hasty decisions. For these reasons, Jonathan and I believe marijuana should not be legalized.
So you said that we should wait to see what happens in Colorado before legalizing, right?
Right.
Hasn't it been 2 years since we legalized it in Colorado?
Sure, but we think that we need to wait a longer period of time so that we can get a better grip on what the statistics actually say.
How long? And what else can we apply this to? That could be applied to anything. Any new law that we legalize anywhere could say, we should just wait.
Was there a question in there?
Point it out. Point it
Okay.
out. You said that, according to this, that they arrested 745 drivers in the first 6 months?
Yep.
And what was the statistic people beforehand?
So total per year, it was an average of around 1,000 people.
Beforehand?
Yes.
And afterwards it was 1,400. Right.
Roughly.
So
Closer to
less than 40 additional arrests in a whole year in an entire state.
Sure, that sounds like a lot of people who potentially could cause serious driving accidents.
Okay.
40 people who could cause crashes because they're driving under the influence is a lot.
All right. So you said this doesn't do anything to end police racism, correct?
Right.
So should we take any action at all? What can we get rid of?
We
What
could
was your
certainly
approach?
focus on the underlying issues causing police racism, such as the actual racism, rather than focusing on marijuana policy, which is not a cause of the racism, but simply a way that it manifests.
So if we instituted that policy somewhere, how long would we have to wait for it to be effective in another state before we implement it everywhere?
If we implemented what policy?
The ones you say will get rid of racism.
I think that, well, one, that's not something to face about. But 2, I think that we would probably have to wait to see how it worked for several years before we knew if it worked or not.
So not 2 years, but 10 years?
Maybe.
Okay.
We don't take a stance on that.
Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Okay.
Are my esteemed opponents ready? As the second affirmative speaker in today's debate, we're going to review the negative team's arguments and basically demonstrate that the concrete advantages presented by my partner Matthew still stand. I spent this afternoon trying to think for a metaphor for this debate because I sort of suspected where my colleagues were probably going to go with their arguments. And I really, unfortunately, couldn't come up with a good metaphor. So what I came up with instead is a really, really bad metaphor. My partner, Matt, in the first affirmative, presented you 3 very concrete, good reasons why we should change our prohibitionist policies. And in a way, you can think of it as if Matt sort of presented you with a brand new shiny car, okay? In a debate, the negative team's job is to destroy that car. They're supposed to knock down all 3 of Matthew's contentions. And what we really had in the first negative speech today is really more like a fender bender. They barely put a dent in the fender. They barely scratched the vehicle. The arguments sort of pick at little pieces of what we say, but they don't really give you any concrete reason why you should continue to defend prohibitionist policies that are obviously a failure. So let's begin by taking a look at the couple of arguments that Taylor makes first before she goes down the affirmative case. And first she talks about statistical manipulation and reads this evidence from the Office of Drug Policy. There are really about 3 essential problems with this position. One problem, of course, is even the evidence from the Office of Drug Policy, which is a little bit biased, by the way, never says that the harms we cite aren't real. So perhaps they have a point. Maybe it's not 10,000 people a year that have their lives snuffed out in the United States. Maybe it's only 9,500. Shoot, maybe it's only 9,000. But here again, you can see they've only dented the vehicle. They've only scratched the vehicle. Their evidence and their analysis in no way suggests that the harms we cite are non-existent. It simply argues that perhaps those harms are a little bit smaller. And we certainly think that things like the destruction of the Bill of Rights and the ending of human lives is reason enough why we ought to change our policy. A second difficulty with their evidence and their argument here is their analysis is based on the idea, well, a lot of people that are in prison or in jail, it's because they did something besides possess marijuana or besides smoke marijuana. And we admit that's true. I don't think we've ever made the argument that every single person that's incarcerated was only for marijuana. Since both teams seem to like Professor Bender's article, though, it's interesting to know how many of those cases are only marijuana related. In the same article, one other thing Professor Bender also says is marijuana alone accounts for 75,000 annual United States arrests, most for possession. In 2007, for example, state and local police arrested 872,000 people for marijuana offenses. So we agree. We don't think that all 2 or 3 million people that are sitting around in prisons are due solely to marijuana offenses, but thousands upon thousands of people are. And remember in our impact evidence that Matthew reads you some of the implications of that. Those people are stigmatized for life. There are all kinds of categories of jobs that they will never be eligible to obtain. They cannot obtain government assistance from a lot of programs simply because they enjoy recreational use of marijuana. And we think that even if the statistics maybe are a little fuzzy, that those are real and concrete harms, and those are important enough reasons why we ought to change our policy. The second position that Taylor reached to is this whole idea that we should delay, because we've just sort of started the legalization of recreational use in Washington and California. Well, there are a couple of problems with this position as well. One is, of course, we do have plenty of experience with legalization, both in the states that are experimenting with it and in other countries. And the other is really think about the position the negative is asking you to take. What they're saying is there may be some unknown harm lurking out there. There may be some horrible consequence of changing policy that we don't know about yet. And their position to you is they are okay with waiting a few years while 10,000 people die in this country each year. And also remember that thousands of people have their lives destroyed. And that doesn't even count all the deaths in Mexico from the drug cartels. So this idea that we should wait and not change policy when we have lives being lost and lives being destroyed, and while the courts, in their zeal to fight the war on drugs, are shredding the Bill of Rights, I mean, it's just really a bad idea. If they can't give you a concrete reason to wait, now is the time to act, and now is the time to change the policies. Okay, let's talk about the first advantage that Matthew cites for you when he talks about the economic benefits. And here again, I feel like the negative arguments just sort of scratch at the surface and don't really give you much of a reason to reject the advantages we presented. And the first thing Taylor says is she cites you evidence that says not everyone will switch to buying marijuana legally. We agree. Our evidence in our case is not based upon that. Looking at an article that I think I saw in the Huffington Post a couple weeks ago, right now in Colorado, it's actually only about a 60-40 split. About 60% of the recreational users in Colorado are now buying it through the dispensaries, and the other 40% are still using the black market. However, that is enough of a decrease in revenue to hurt the drug cartels. It is enough of an increase in revenue to help our country, so we can fund things that we should, so that we can have more good jobs for people, so we can have money for health care and education. And you'll notice our evidence assumes that. And so that's a real problem with their position, is that they're certainly not arguing that no one will shift over. And I think as our evidence from the judge clearly demonstrates, that's enough to make a difference. Taylor talks about the public health cost. You'll notice she's not able to cite any evidence or any statistics. And I think when we look at the way we view these types of victimless crimes in this country, if they want to make a public health comparison, why don't they stand up and advocate prohibition for alcohol? Because I can guarantee you it kills more people and it costs more billions in health care than marijuana ever could. So if they want to make this argument, they ought to make some sort of a comparative argument. Taylor talks about inhaling smoke. I happen to be a cigarette smoker, and I'm pretty sure that marijuana smoke is not nearly as bad. So here again, what does she give you in comparison? Productivity, $193 billion a year loss. You know, this is just the same old alarmist rhetoric we hear over and over. Why don't they show us empirically where that productivity loss happened in the Netherlands? Where's the evidence that all of a sudden Colorado and Washington's economy are crashing due to this loss of productivity? In fact, those two states are doing as well as any states in the country in our current challenging economic times. So if they really want to make this argument, let's see them give you some concrete evidence to prove that. And that pretty well tells you that in terms of the Washington advantage, in terms of the economic advantage, that the experiences already out there pretty clearly demonstrate that the negative team is simply wrong about this. Let's talk about the justice advantage. And here again, Taylor repeats her argument about statistical manipulation and other crimes. And I think the evidence we already presented from Bender showing you it's over 700,000 people a year that go to jail for nothing but marijuana proves that even though there are some people that are in jail for multiple charges, that this is a significant enough problem that we certainly ought to consider changes. Taylor tells you that simply legalizing marijuana does not prevent companies from drug testing. We will outright concede that point. We do not in this debate have a proposition where we're talking about whether or not companies should drug test. But one thing we would note is as our country inevitably moves toward more decriminalization and more legalization, that has the effect of slowly but surely changing our culture. And as the culture of society changes, that will change the mindset of companies that still misinformedly do drug tests. It's interesting, our second contention about justice had three major points. And the first one was wrecking lives. The second point, which is actually from Judge Taraya, by the way, he's a judge on the First Circuit Court of Appeals, so he sits on one of the second highest courts in the land. This is evidence from a man who has spent his life enforcing the drug laws, and he has sadly reached conclusion in his old age that it's been a failure, that it's been a loss, that it's been a waste of time, and it is very courageous for a man sitting on a federal bench to come out and publicly say, look, we need to change this. And the important point is because they cannot refute it, they simply ignore the arguments from the judge that because of our zeal to fight the war on drugs, we have shredded the Bill of Rights. The Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable search and seizures, you as a citizen have that protection, unless the charge is a drug crime. Then we ignore that. You have the right against self-incrimination if you're charged with robbing a bank. But if you're charged with a drug crime, we ignore that. You have the right to be represented in court by a lawyer, unless you're charged with a drug crime, and then we seize your assets before you ever get into court, so you can no longer have a lawyer. And that evidence from Torreo, I think, pretty clearly demonstrates those points. In the same article, he goes on and points out that really all six of the key Bill of Rights have been shredded by our zeal to have an exception to the drug war. And here again, if we could just legalize marijuana, we begin to change that culture, and hopefully that begins to change the way our courts rule. Because let's face it, American society doesn't have a lot unique about it if we decide we're just going to throw out the Bill of Rights in our effort and our zeal to prosecute this drug war. The third part of the justice contention we present has to do with the idea that enforcement of drug laws are racist. And really, I want you to remember the statistics that are cited in Matt's evidence because it's really phenomenal. It is so ridiculously disproportional that it's unbelievable. It's like 25 times more likely. The negative makes a very good point here again, and here again I will credit that. If police officers are determined to be racist, they have more than one tool. But we take away one of the major tools that are available to them. So we'll agree, we're not going to stop all racial profiling. We're not going to stop all discrimination within the justice system. But we take away such a key tool, if that only saves 5,000 victims a year, that's still a significant enough reason that we ought to legalize. We certainly don't think we solve all the problems in the system, but we isolate this one problem that we think is important, and I don't feel like the negative really comes to grips with that. Now our third contention, human lives. Remember, we're talking over 10,000 of our own citizens a year, and many, many more times that in Mexico. Here Taylor basically tells you there will still be a black market. Now, when we cite the evidence from the judge, he's clearly smart enough to know that legalization is not going to immediately eliminate the black market, and we agree with that. But he makes the point that 10,000 lives could be saved. Taylor also makes the argument there's this sort of idea that if we take away all the money that the cartels are making from marijuana, they're going to shift and do other things that are going to be just as bad or maybe worse. Well, there are a couple of problems with this argument. And the first one is just think about it from a logical point of view. So we're talking about the kingpins of drug cartels. These are people that have decided a few things about life. One, they want to be very, very rich. Two, they are willing to break the law and risk going to prison to be very, very rich. They're even willing to risk premature, violent death because they want to spend their life in a rich, lavish fashion. So this whole idea they have that they're sort of taking it easy on these other areas, it's like they're so rich from selling pot that they're not really trying to human traffic and do this sort of sex trafficking. They're not really trying to sell methamphetamine. What a ridiculous proposition. These folks want to make bucket loads of money, and the whole suggestion that they're not really just sort of dabbling in these other areas is just kind of ridiculous. But more important, let's take a look at what the experts say, because the experts are pretty clear on the fact that legalizing marijuana is going to smash the drug cartels. We offer more evidence from Nick Zayak in 2014 when he says, at the same time, any time a cartel is forced to exit a trade, especially one with previously high margins, it generally comes out weaker than before. More evidence from the British journalist Ian Grillo in 2012, where he notes that the U.S. federal government, wrong source. We'll talk about Martin and Rashidi from the New York Times instead in 2014, where they actually sort of address this idea of human trafficking and stuff. And they say, as long as drug prohibitions endure, the cartel leaders can continue to use their profits and influence to further corruption, such as human trafficking and extortion. So if the negatives focus for you in this debate is sort of this red herring that all of a sudden we're going to have more human trafficking because the cartels desperately have to make up the lost revenue, taking away their revenue actually prevents them from expanding those enterprises. So in effect, we captured that argument. We tried prohibition in this country in, the 1920s or 1930s, where we prohibited alcohol. It was a complete and total disaster, and it made organized crime in our country stronger. We have now tried the war on drugs in this country for several decades, and the results have been the same. It makes organized crime and the drug cartels stronger. It costs human lives. It destroys our justice system, and it unnecessarily stigmatizes people for the rest of their lives simply because they enjoy a plant that grows naturally. So we think that the car is going to be intact at the end of this round. We doubt they'll even manage to give it a flat tire, and so in the last speech we're going to ask you to vote affirmative. Thank you.
Ready? All right. Okay, first off, let's talk about your argument about the Bill of Rights. Now, you say that the Bill of Rights is being destroyed, but can you give me any examples of when someone has been denied a lawyer or otherwise had their rights taken away?
Absolutely. If they stop you in your car and you have an ounce of marijuana on you, under the drug forfeiture laws, they may immediately seize your vehicle forever without ever going to court, and the burden of proof is on you to go back and get your car. Same way, if they find an ounce of marijuana in your house, they can seize your house. So how are you going to afford a lawyer? You're going to get the basic legal aid lawyer against the government that knows they can get a $100,000 house out of the case. So they have a great deal of zeal to prosecute it.
Okay. Okay, so you sort of talk about the desire of these drug cartels to be rich, and you say they're going to try anything they can to be rich. Why then would they simply give up on trying to find other means of making money when marijuana is legalized?
Well, it's not that we're really saying they would give up. I'm sure they would try something, but your whole notion that they're not really trying to do human trafficking, these are people that want big buckets of cash and they will do anything to get. So, I mean, they're doing human trafficking anyway. If they can make money selling methamphetamine, they're not slacking off because they don't want more money. They want big buckets of cash, and we agree they want money, but you know, we take away some of their money. Whereas your suggestion that, oh, well, they're just really piddling around with trafficking now because they don't really care about money, it's just kind of a silly argument to us.
Okay, so you think that as of now, they're not focusing on marijuana, but they actually are fully diversified?
Actually, one of the pieces of evidence I didn't read yet, which we'll read if you want to persist in this argument, basically says they are fully diversified. That was the next piece of evidence I was about to read. They'll do anything to make cash, and we can actually take away some of their cash and do a lot of great things for other people, like save their lives.